What happens to morality when we remove the ground beneath it? In this episode, I sit down with philosopher and psychologist Dr. Lance Bush, a specialist in moral psychology and metaethics, to unpack what it means to live in a world without objective moral truths. Lance brings a rare dual lens of academic training in both psychology and philosophy, and he's at the forefront of research asking a bold question: do everyday people even have a metaethical view? Or are most of us just navigating the world without ever really interrogating our moral assumptions? We talk about why humans evolved morality, what we're really doing when we make moral claims, and whether the decline of traditional frameworks like religion leaves modern people morally disorientated or liberated. This episode isn't a debate, it's an exploration, one that asks, can we live ethically without objective truth? What is the role of story, myth, and meaning in a post-realist moral landscape? And what's left to hold on to when everything is up for negotiation? Let's get into it. Okay. So Lance, welcome to the podcast. Thank you very much for joining me today and my audience. Would you like to start us off by just introducing yourself, where you're from as well? Because I'm based here in Australia, Melbourne. Just a quick little intro to your academic background as well, please.
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Lance Bush. I'm currently in New York, and my background is in philosophy and psychology, and I primarily specialize in the psychology of metaethics and more broadly in experimental philosophy. The main focus of my research is on the methodological challenges that we confront in trying to evaluate how people without formal training in philosophy, what I tend to call non-philosophers, not the most creative label, how they interpret questions about philosophy. There are many, many challenges that I discuss in my work. And so that's the big focus is on how do you get people that don't have training in a technical topic to understand questions you're asking when you're asking about questions that require typically this whole technical apparatus for people to even know what you're asking. So that's a big focus of my research. The main stuff is moral realism and anti-realism. I do a lot of interdisciplinary research. I draw on both philosophy and psychology. For me, the two are very seamlessly integrated. Often people, when they do interdisciplinary work, there's a presumption that you kind of put on one hat and then put on another, and it just means you work in both worlds. But for me, I work in both worlds at the same time. So that's the research that I do. As far as my educational background, I did philosophy and psychology as an undergrad. Then I did my master's in philosophy at Tufts, and then I did my PhD in psychology at Cornell. I will say, though, that I did a PhD in psychology, but I still brought a bit of philosophy into it.
Yep.
And there was a big philosophical component to the psychology. It was basically doing empirical research of the kind I just described. So, yeah, that's what I do.
Awesome. Cheers. Thank you for that introduction. And I'm interested about something you said there in relation to what you're trying to understand in like how non-philosophers can understand these like moral questions. Is that right? Is that right? Yeah. And so is it just a question of like how they can like understand it, or is it like how they can like understand it and then have it, say, like brought into their life, or like how they might already be doing it?
It's a little bit of both. So typically, the big question that I focus on is this body of research that asks the question, are non-philosophers moral realists, or are they moral anti-realists? In other words, do they think that there are these objective facts about what's morally right or wrong that are true independent of anyone's goals, standards, or values? Kind of like we might typically think of scientific facts, that, the kinds of facts we discover about the world. Or do they think that moral facts, if there are any, are dependent on customs, personal preferences, that sort of thing? That would be some type of typical, like a relativist or constructivist position. Or maybe they think there's no moral facts at all. So there's all this research that's intended to elicit their response to these sorts of questions. It's not always clear whether researchers think that they already have a view on the matter, or whether they're prompting them to have an intuition for the first time. Researchers are not super clear on that, but I will say a lot of the research seems to imply that they think that people have a position, and it's simply a matter of figuring out what position they already have. Whether or not that's supposed to impact their behavior is also not clear, but there are some behavioral studies that look at the alleged behavioral consequences of endorsing realism or some type of anti-realist position. So it does look like researchers think that people have views about these things and that they do impact people's behavior. I'm very skeptical of either of these. So, my interpretation of the data is that the reason why people struggle to interpret these questions as intended is because they don't already have views about these positions. Kind of the way that people don't typically have views about how to interpret quantum mechanics. Like, it'd be very weird to think that when someone says, I think it's going to rain tomorrow, that they're like taking a mini world's interpretation of quantum mechanics, and they think that there's quantum events, and like in some universes it rains and some it doesn't. No one's thinking that way when they're making causal claims. At least I don't think so, and I think it'd be very weird to think they are. So I think metaethics is very much the same way, and that everyday moral behavior is so entrenched in addressing practical questions that it's not it doesn't require any theoretical underpinnings or commitment one way or the other. And this view is called metaethical indeterminacy. The only person I've seen advocate this in the academic literature is a philosopher, Michael Gill, in a fairly recent paper, 2009, called Indeterminacy and Variability in Metaethics. And I kind of ran with that, and that's what my research ends up offering, an empirical defense of that thesis.
Okay, cool. I did have some specific questions that I wanted to bring up there, but I'm just worried about starting off way too sharp for a slightly more general audience that I have. But that does flow into what I was intending to ask more up front. But so what do you think from your perspective are we really trying to understand when we are engaging, discussing, or debating metaethics then?
Well, there's a number of topics in metaethics. So metaethics is this branch of moral philosophy that deals with the most abstract and fundamental questions about the nature of morality. So it asks questions like, is there any sort of objective moral truth? But it also looks at questions like, how do we acquire moral knowledge, which is an epistemological question? Are moral beliefs necessarily motivating? Like, if you believe something's morally wrong, must you have at least some compunction to comply with that or not? So that's the motivational internalism, externalism debate. There's a variety of other metaethical questions you could ask. You could focus on the semantics, like what do moral sentences mean? So there's so many questions you could ask. For me, the big one is the realism, anti-realism divide, which I want to say it's a metaphysical dispute, but at least some philosophers think that you could actually strip the metaphysics out and make it just a conceptual dispute. So that'd be like Scanlon and Parfit. I don't mean to get too technical here, but that's the central question of metaethics. But I think I lost track of what you were initially asking me. What's my focus?
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's more when any philosopher really, or any person is having a discussion around metaethics, what is it we're really trying to understand? So as you mentioned, you focus on this this conversation between a realism or an anti-realism. So what are we trying to do when we're even engaging in that conversation? Yeah,
I think that when we're talking about metaethics, we're trying to understand morality at the most abstract and fundamental level. The most fundamental question just be what is morality? What are we doing when we talk about morality? What are we trying to do? What kinds of are there what kind of moral reality is there? If there is one, what's its nature? So you're asking these very fundamental questions, but I don't think that there's one question. I think it's a kind of collection, it's kind of cluster of questions that what makes it challenging is that it spans the whole range of the major branches of philosophy, because you could say metaethics is clearly a part of ethics, but you have the two other major areas outside of axiology or value theory are metaphysics and epistemology, and those are absolutely essential to metaethics. Because metaethics, the central realism, anti-realism question is a metaphysical question, and then there's also the question of how do we acquire knowledge of these moral facts. So that's an epistemological question. So it's kind of all over the place, which is what makes it such a. It's kind of like if you're dealing with philosophy of religion. There's epistemological questions, there's moral questions, there's metaphysical questions, and they're all bound up in one another in this just big old conceptual pretzel that's very hard to extricate any particular component.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's been my experience with it so far. I think that's a great way to describe this conceptual pretzel of questions. And so, but maybe it's one of the things that I've sort of been smashing my head into recently is that, do I just end up describing what shapes moral life, or is it that I'm actually then trying to understand it then? And so that's then I think where I then go back to the question of what am I really trying to do then when I'm discussing metaethics then? Is it just the fact that I'm describing it, or I am actually trying to unlock something here? Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I think that what we're trying to do is itself, I mean, this is going to sound cheesy maybe, I think that is itself a philosophical question. So for me, I am through and through an empiricist on philosophical matters. And when I look at the question of morality, I see it, to me, what I would say is obvious to me. I don't think this has to be obvious to everybody, but to me, morality is a social phenomenon that arose among humans. And to the extent that we want to study it, we should be studying it at the way that we would study laws or institutions or history. We would look at these empirical questions about human psychology, human practices and institutions. We'd look at, like, the fields that should really be digging into morality are psychology, sociology, anthropology, history, neuroscience, biology, evolutionary biology. So for me, it's very hard to see morality and not think this is obviously something that should be addressed from a heavily empirical and heavily interdisciplinary perspective. And yet, moral philosophers take those foundational questions about metaethics and they abstract them away from these empirical considerations to such an extent that it's almost treated as presumptively disconnected and alienated and weirdly on its own little intellectual island, where sometimes you're allowed to bring empirical stuff into the picture, but they're always a little grudging about it, always a little hesitant about it. And I just think that it's that the sort of standard Western analytic philosophical approach to metaethics is too not empirical, it's too disconnected, and it's too it's isolated itself too much from the other disciplines. So what I think we're looking at is fundamentally a practical human enterprise that should be addressed from a thoroughly empirical perspective. And by thoroughly empirical, I just mean it like that needs to be part of the roots. That doesn't mean the only questions are empirical questions, but they shouldn't be treated as this afterthought or this auxiliary thing. They should be treated as very central.
Yeah, I love what you're saying there about like making it more practical, looking at it a more like practical lens, and I'm interested in to ask, like, so then how does it look when, as you said, like you're being like as heavily as an empiricist as possible in this then?
For me, it looks like the way that I teach my courses, the way I do my research. I'm studying metaethics, but I was in a psychology department for my PhD. So people might look at that and go, how are you doing philosophy in a psychology department? Well, how am I... I look at psychology and I think, well, psychology, just like any of the other sciences, I don't see why they should be treated as totally disconnected from philosophy. And conversely, I don't see why philosophy should be totally disconnected from the sciences. The very distinctions between these disciplines are an artifact of recent institutions and like the recent history of how academic institutions started carving up specialization. So we have to get people to write PhDs. They have to write on novel topics. We have to make all these disciplinary divisions. So, because of departmental funding and political reasons and personal reasons. But the reality doesn't give a damn about how we carve up and categorize things. We could have philosophy-psychology as a discipline if we wanted to. There's no rule against that. And so these disciplinary divisions are artificial. I don't respect them. Like as divisions in and of themselves, I'm perfectly happy to respect departmental, like if I'm teaching in this department, clearly I'm not in that department. But from a methodological and an academic perspective, there's no reason to treat the disciplines as fundamentally different. Now, okay, having said all that, for me, when I look at the question of what's the nature of morality, I want to ask some more basic questions like, where did morality come from? Why do people have morality? What is it that we're even talking about? And that immediately starts prompting empirical questions. So here would be a question. Do all societies lexicalize moral terminology in the way that we use moral language in English? So are you going to find cognate terms if you go from this, if you look at this culture or that culture, or you went into the historical past? I suspect the answer is no. They don't all lexicalize morality, moral terminology. And, Edward Mashery is a philosopher that does empirical work. And he has argued this in the Atlas of Moral Psychology. He has a paper called Morality, a Historical Invention, where he argues that the very notion of a distinctive normative domain, morality, is a historical artifact that emerged in some cultures and not in others. That research relies extensively on psychology, history, anthropology, and other sorts of empirical fields. So someone might look at that and say, that's not philosophy. Okay, well... we need to pin down the topic of study empirically before we can even appropriately address it. So I don't see these as fundamentally distinct from one another. So for me, I don't know how to approach the question of metaethics without looking at it through the lens of this heavily empirical approach.
Yep. And do you find then that in your research that you're looking at one of these bigger questions, or you're looking at metaethics, and then you're going to what would be then empirical evidence, you're going to anthropological or sociological studies, and then reviewing that for how say the metaethics can then be either justified or critiqued? Or are you sort of looking first at the empirical evidence, looking at different anthropological studies, you're looking at different cultures, and as you said potentially reviewing the lexicon of moral language that they're using, and then going back to then the moral frameworks or the moral theories, and then say judging them on that?
Yeah, I actually approach it from both directions at the same time. So I look at what academic philosophers are doing, and I look at the way that they're addressing moral sentences and moral language and that sort of thing. And then I'm also looking at the empirical stuff. So there's a variety of some of it is speculative, some of it is more grounded in direct empirical work. But you have work Ken Stiralny has this great book called The Evolved Apprentice, where he looks at a more fundamental question about the nature and evolution of human cognition. I think it's chapter 7. He has a great chapter on morality, where he addresses, how these sort of how morality might arise under within his model of this, we evolve to be these sort of to undergo a kind of enculturation through an apprenticeship process, where what humans are really adapted to do is to acquire local ecological knowledge, where we become really adapted to our local environments by this cumulative cultural evolution, where someone that knows how to build spears, or they know how to extract, how to get clean water in a particular environment, these sorts of things. You don't just know how to do that. That's not going to be something that's innate, nor is it the sort of thing that would be learned via imitation. A lot of the types of skills, like napping for building, for creating early hand axes, that requires quite a bit of skill. It's not that easy to do. That's not something you just learn. You don't just watch someone and know how to do it. You have to be trained to do it. And so he argues people basically have to be trained into the particular skills. People specialize, and you need specialists to train people. So you need populations, family groups need to be sufficiently large to have enough of the different types of skills to be adapted to that particular ecology. So there's all these specific features of the way that humans evolved, where we go through this long developmental period, this long learning period. Now, I don't recall exactly what he says in that book, but how I would construe it is that you could see a lot of our social institutions and practices as a type of technology that it's a kind of behavioral technology. So there are skills like how to make a bow, how to build a boat, that sort of thing. There's also social technologies that are instantiated in a group as a whole, and you learn those by being taught how to comply with them, how they're enforced. And you could view morality as a kind of social technology that we created for regulating behavior, promoting cooperation, minimizing in-group conflict. It has all these functional social roles. So that's how I view morality. So, when I'm looking at this stuff, one thing to note, Kim Stiralny is a philosopher. So this is if you read the book, it's hard to tell because it engages so much with anthropological and psychological and evolutionary stuff. That's why I think people should be doing philosophy much of the time. I certainly think there's questions in logic and stuff where I don't know what the point of doing a bunch of psychological research would necessarily be. Maybe there wouldn't be a point. But at least for the study of morality, it's very weird, I think, to study morality without a very close engagement with and familiarity with the most cutting edge theories about what the heck morality even is. It's very how do you study the topic of morality without thinking that's relevant? But philosophers do this. I find it strange.
Yeah, totally. And just with that, what you shared there, and your sort of overview of that chapter from the Evolved Apprentice, I resonate with a lot of what you've shared there, and what that's making me think about now is, and what you mentioned that comment about like how did you say that, in terms of like minimizing like group conflict in there as being like a consequence of these like social technologies that we've evolved or we've developed in there. And so I think my question then is so why might this matter now for us to be looking at like metaethics from this more like empiricist perspective? And when I say like why does it matter now, I don't want to like lead you into an answer, but I say look at the world at the moment and I see like a disenfranchisement. There seems to be a lot more like conflict like going on, or maybe it's more that there's just a heightened sense of like polarization like going on. But I'm not trying to like lead you into an answer, but the question is then why does it matter now?
Yeah, well, honestly, I'm not sure that it matters so much for addressing those issues. I don't know what's driving the current global cultural trend towards polarization and conflict. It'd be
100 different things going into it, I'm sure.
So I don't know how much metaethics relates to that, and I don't know how much the study of the origins of morality relates to that. The latter probably matters more. There might be some psychological insights to glean into why current conflicts are going on, but I really don't know. I don't study that topic.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's not necessarily like we have to expand it out to like these larger conflicts going on in terms of like the wars, but even just at that more like smaller societal level in terms of increased like what's it called what's it called, like physical like violent crimes like going on, or like more like conflict going on and over social media like communities in like comment sections, whatever it is like, and I think one of the things that I feel like I see is people maybe acting say more immorally, if I could do it. And I know I'm making like some bigger like claims here, and I was trying to avoid like getting to that, but I suppose like why I'm like trying to ask the question again is that I'm not necessarily looking at these like larger conflicts of like wars, more in terms of like other conflicts like going on even at just like a smaller scale. And that's where I see then that there might be like purpose in looking at like how people like create moral frameworks, because I have this suspicion that why it's important to look at and like study now is because people have become say disengaged with a sense of morality, and then or therefore are living more say moralless lives.
There's so many factors, as you had mentioned. It's going to be some like multivariate thing. It would be super speculative for me to get into that. So I don't think I would be able to give a good answer. I mean, I study topics that don't have any direct and immediate practical application, in part, sort of paradoxically, because what I want to do with the kind of research I do is convince people that a lot of the more abstract and abstruse philosophical topics are not worthwhile, and that the practical stuff is important. So I'm sort of trying to indirectly contribute to the importance of focusing on practical stuff by focusing on why we shouldn't focus on the impractical stuff. I know that sounds very strange, but insofar as I do that, most of what I do is I do critical work on other people's work. And so I don't have quite so much by way of a positive account of human moral psychology. I will say a little bit about what I do, what direction I do lean in, though. So one account that really had a big impact on me was Sperber and Mercier's argumentative theory of reasoning. So they had a paper in Brain and Behavioral Sciences out some years ago now. Now more recently they have a book called The Enigma of Reason, where they expand on this. And what they argue is that if you look at human reasoning, you might think that it evolved to like optimize for true beliefs, and that so to the extent that people engage in argumentation and reasoning, that they do so for the purpose of like, it's adaptive to have more true beliefs and less false beliefs. But what they argue is that maybe that's got to be some part of it. But what they argue is that a big functional role, a big adaptive role for arguing and reasoning is persuasion. And you can persuade people of complete bullshit. Like, you do not have to persuade people of things that are objectively true. You can persuade people of whatever it is that you think will serve your interests. And if you look at all these anomalous features of the way that people reason, motivated reasoning, people are more attentive to arguments that support their position than arguments that don't support their position. There's all these ways in which people appear to have biases and to make errors in judgment. Now, all else being equal, one would think if we're adapted to reason, we should reason in ways that are prone towards error and bias. You'd think that these errors would dissolve and not be selected for. So why would we have reasoning processes that are not so good at reasoning? Well, you have to ask the question, reasoning for what? If the question is reasoning for true beliefs, it looks like they're prone to error. But if part of the function of our reasoning and our argumentation is to persuade others, so you could recast these biases as advantages. It's actually advantageous to reason in certain sorts of ways. And so what they propose is that a big component of what natural selection favored was a predisposition to argue in ways that are more persuasive, that a big function of reasoning is to reason, you could put it this way, more like a lawyer and less like a philosopher. And you could see how you could apply that to morality, and it immediately has this massive explanatory potential. So when people argue, why do they engage in so much moral grandstanding? Why would people argue about morality in this or that way? Well, they don't have to be arguing because they think that their position is the stance-independently morally correct position. Why would people care whether it's a stance-independent moral fact, like whether it's true independent of their goal, standards, or values? When people are arguing, people typically have a purpose behind arguing. They have some goal, and those goals are typically social. When I'm arguing for my moral positions, it's because I want the world to be a certain way. If I'm arguing against what I think is a human rights abuse, I don't just think, well, it's true that the human rights abuse is objectively wrong, so we need to correct for the human rights abuse by implementing laws. No, I don't want the world to be that way. That's why I'm arguing. People outside abortion clinics that are arguing against the people going in to get an abortion or defending it don't have to think it's objectively wrong. Maybe they do. They could just say, I don't want to live in a world where people all get abortions. And that is what's motivating them. And so when you look at it from that perspective, why the hell would anyone just argue because they think something is true? All sorts of things are potentially true or false, and I don't care about most of those facts. You could go out and count the blades of grass. You don't find people arguing, hey, there's exactly 100,612 blades of grass in this part of the yard. And someone going, no, it's 100,409 or something. No, I don't know if those numbers make sense. But you don't see people arguing about that because people don't care how many blades of grass are in their yard. People argue about things that they care about. So when those people are arguing, if you then appreciate that a big part of what they're doing is simply trying to do a number of social goals, engage in a number of social goals. What social goals might they be engaged in? One, looking good to people that they consider allies or friends. So a big part of arguing is going to be signaling, look at the positive character traits I have. Look how great of a person I am. Another thing might be trying to get people to join your side. So you might be interested in persuading people, and that doesn't require that you be correct or incorrect about objective matters of fact. Another thing could just be trying to, like if you're engaged in reasoning, to sort out which person would be a better, or which side would be a better side for you from a social perspective. And so there's a huge number of ways in which argumentation, reasoning, and disputes about moral issues in the public sphere are likely underwritten by social objectives of people, not by a pursuit of determining what's true in some biased and disinterested way. Why would people focus on the latter and not the former? That's a very weird way to construe human psychology, as if we're all these like weird, unbiased jurors of the truth. That's not what humans are like. And so how does this relate to understanding human behavior? Well, I think when you take that psychological perspective on how people are, and then you look at how academic philosophers think about, ordinary moral thought and behavior, they view it in such a sterilized, intellectualized way that they presume that ordinary moral language is underwritten by this sterilized intellectual goal. And then to the extent that people fail to reason in accordance with that, that's some sort of performance error or mistake people are making. No, it's not a bug that ordinary moral language is inconsistent, sloppy, weird, and doesn't clearly comport with any metaethical position. That's a feature. So viewed in that light, I think it raises serious questions about the presuppositions that philosophers are bringing to the table in the first place. And so I do think it sheds light on how we approach these philosophical questions. As far as how you can apply that to practical questions, not really sure.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested to ask then, because if I really resonated with what you were sharing there. And so if we're as these like social beings, we're not necessarily like aiming for finding like a moral truth, and when we go about like our actions, when we're engaging with these like moral dilemmas, that there's this case that we have this capacity to aim for like developing our capacity for persuasion. Then is that suggestive at all of then like a breakdown of some like moral consensus? But I know you said before about like, you know, we're aiming for like a good in the sense of wanting to like make ourselves look good to say like a group that we are like motivated to say like be a part of, and so potentially we're just like we still have a moral consensus in that sense, that we're still aiming for a good in that regard. But does it lend any sort of thought to being that there is like a breakdown of a moral consensus then, if say persuasion is the thing that we're sort of evolving for rather than finding that objective moral truth?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So
Okay.
if cultures start to bifurcate and you start having subcultures become more and more isolated from one another, or more and more communicative within groups instead of the outgroups, they can start engaging in like in-group amping up. So once you're part of an in-group, some of the things that can happen is it can become an echo chamber, and there becomes an arms race to signal how much you're committed to your group by escalating your commitments within the group, and you derogate the outgroup. The outgroup becomes increasingly seen as worse. Why is that happening now? I'm not sure, but what you would want to ask is if this is an anomalous occurrence in human history, well, what's changed? And you could get hints into the possible causal factors contributing to that. And the obvious big change is the rise of the internet and the ability for people to more readily communicate with one another. The question, though, is did that precede or follow the beginning of this polarization trend that we've observed? Like, you know, I don't know exactly what, like late 90s when the internet really, became a big thing. Was the polarization already starting before that, or did it start after that? I'm not sure. Like that's where I would start. It's just saying you got to defer to the experts on that. Don't ask me. But technology looks like it's a plausible candidate for an important factor here. People can sit in Facebook groups and steep in people who agree with them and avoid people that disagree with them. So that's a factor. How big of a factor? I don't know. If I had to guess, I'd say I think that's a big factor here. I think technology is a big factor driving this. But there could be a whole bunch of like some sociological and economic changes that are like post-World War II. It could be reverberating across the past 2 or 3 generations. Maybe something to do with the post-World War II generation and how they raise their kids influenced how we are in this generation and how kids are being raised today. And that somehow influenced the culture. I don't know. So as far as like how these psychological insights could bear on that, I mean, that's going to take a synthesis of a very wide amount of very, very tricky data. And one thing to note about that is that what we're going to with most of that data is correlational data, where it's very, very hard to figure out the causes of things. So if you see like increased suicide rates, what's actually causing that? Well, if it increased suicide rates in teens, it's very easy to say that that's due to like social media. Is it? I don't know, because finding a correlation doesn't show that it's causing it. Of course, there could always be some third variable or 17 variables involved. But that starts to get to the point where it's so far removed from the kind of research that I deal with that who knows?
Yeah, of course. No, I can appreciate like your perspective on that, and I suppose just for your sake, like why I would even like ask a question from someone in like your position is the theses that I was playing with in my like anthropology degree, like at the end, was that I was getting this sense that what made say humans human, like what made them distinct from like other entities, from other like mammals, and this is where it sort of ties into my studies with phenomenology as well, was that what made humans humans was their capacity for religious experience. And religious experience isn't necessarily in the, I subscribe to a monotheistic like religion, I go to a specific denomination of like the church, and then I worship like a god. How I was considering like a religious experience was the capacity for a human to consider themselves beyond just like their instinctual like nature, like I say an animal might, where like an average like say bear operating on an instinctual like function, they need to like eat, so they eat, and there's not really a question of whether it's like right or wrong for them to like kill an animal. Whereas for a human, they consider themselves like beyond that. They consider like their impact not just like in that present, but also like in the future, and then their past also impacts that present negotiation and that conceptualization then of the future. And then the experience part of that religious experience part is that we seem to like do this thing of going to a communion of some form, and so or we engage with say myth, or we engage with story, and that myth or that story might be at the say archetypal level of like sort of a Jungian like archetypal concept of like being able to identify the story of what a mother is or what a hero is, like and then overlaying that at a, whether it's at a conscious or a subconscious level of the world, and then how it might like manifest itself. But then also like music is a deeply human thing. From my knowledge, there is only one other like animal in the world that creates music, and it's this like Australian black cockatoo, which like picks up a stick and uses it like a percussion instrument, but it's purely for a musical thing. And so it seems to be like music is one of those very like human things, and I've heard Jordan Peterson describe music as amalgamous to the way that psychologically we unravel like the patterns of the universe. The way our optical structure is created is we identify the patterns of things, and that's how we come to understand it. And music is this like description of the universe, whereas these layered like patterns. And so when we think about how we might even like engage in music, say we like go to a festival, we go to like a concert, we are all in like unison in this like group communion, looking up at this one figure, almost in worship, the same way that someone might go to like a church, and then they look at this so that the preacher, and they're all in sort of like unison, like looking up at this message, and this person talking about say reality, they're talking about morality. And even if when I was considering, well, people aren't say going to church as much anymore, societies are coming like more secular, my worry or concern is that it's not that people have become like less religious, it's that they've swapped out their religion of these like monotheistic religions, and what they've done is swapped it out for things like consumerism. Like consumerism has become the new religion, in which you go to these like say like a shopping mall, and they're almost set up like cathedrals, these really like tall buildings, and it's like instead of like worshipping to like a god, you're worshipping to like your Adidas or your Nike, and that becomes like your sort of god, and you pay your penitence, and you purchase this thing, and that rather than getting access to like heaven, it's getting you access to like say becoming more sexy, and that ends up say becoming like the philosophy of the religion. So it was a very, very long way, roundabout way of describing like why I think there is this innate capacity for like religious experience. But for the context of this conversation is that it suggests to me that the capacity then for having like a moral framework is then innate to humans, and whether then that moral framework is say it is like shifting, and then it's being turned to say like a consumerism, and then like why is that like the case? Like do we then have a responsibility to engaging more say philosophy, in more philosophy to say reorient our moral framework? Because if we aren't engaging with it, does it leave us say morally disoriented? Do we become this sort of like rudderless ship, and then we end up just like shifting our moral framework around? So I've just like shared like a whole lot with you, and I suppose then like my question at that point is like, does that like resonate with you in any way? Like, again, like does it suggest any form of like moral, like anti-realism you said, and then there's not necessarily like these objective like truths, or is it even the case that people have these like moral frameworks?
So I think like our moral frameworks, the extent to which shared moral frameworks within a community, whether it be a religious community, it could be a secular community, that personally I would take metaphors. I would take like calling like Nike like our religion and consumerism religion to be a bit of a strained metaphor. I don't know if I'd find that. One moment, my dogs are going.
Yeah, you're good. All good.
Okay. So I would take that metaphor to be a bit strained myself. But I could say a couple things about this. One would be that to the extent that religious communities serve to unify people around a shared moral framework, I don't think that requires moral realism. That could be achieved entirely by some sort of intersubjective consensus within that group. And so I do think that if religions serve a practical functional role in bringing communities together around shared values, shared norms, shared cultural history, and bring people together and reduce conflict, to the extent that they potentially have significant palliative social benefits, like these positive effects on society, I think that can operate entirely independent. I don't know if it does, but I think at least can, and I do suspect that it does operate almost entirely autonomously from philosophical considerations of realism and anti-realism. I do worry because, I flagged technology as being a factor here. We do see the growing factor of decreased religiosity, and that doesn't just mean people becoming atheists. It means people just stop going to church. So if you look at like the rates of self-reported atheism, I don't think that they've become super duper duper high, but people just having enough with religion and they stop going. That's like at epidemic levels. And then the question is, what impact does that have on society? Now, I'm an atheist. I'm not a big fan of religions. I mean, the main issue for me is I don't think any of them are true. But I could tell you, I grew up Christian. I've listened to sermons before, and I've been to funerals. I've been to weddings. I've been in beautiful, beautiful churches, and I felt that sense of awe, like standing before something that it took an insane amount of effort for people to make. And then you think, what kind of buildings would I expect to see now for someone to build? Well, it's something that's going to get propped up in a year. It has no beauty to it. It has to put as the very atheist, it has no soul. It's just this. It's just this empty, ugly, brutal, and it's just a lot of where. I have a friend that's really into art and beauty and thinks it's like actually a big thing missing from society. Nothing's beautiful anymore. It's ugly. It's utilitarian and I don't mean that in the philosophical sense. I mean that in like it's
functional sense.
In the functional sense. It's why did society become that way? There's something missing from that. And I was riding high on the whole like new atheism thing. I was like, religion's dumb and bad. And I'm not so sure. Like I have all the same misgivings new atheists had about the promulgation and retention of bigotry and hostility towards people with different religious perspectives and all that sort of thing. Discrimination against atheists. I don't think any of that. I think it's all awful stuff. And I will say I'll wag my finger at religion for all of that. But one of the things it can do is bring people together in ways that I think that atheists have catastrophically failed to do. And it just does not look like it's been good for society. And I can genuinely say I miss that sense that I got from going to churches. I don't think I'll ever be able to get back there because I think I'm past the point where I could be convinced. But the experiences you have there, they can be transformative. They could be deeply meaningful. And what's most critical about that, and music is a big part of this too. When people are singing together, or you're immersed in people singing in one of these atmospheres, you don't just get a sense of something like, it's not like a private meditation. You feel connected to the people around you. That might very well be deeply important for humanity, and it might be very, very bad for us to not be doing that.
So
I do want to say though, real quick,
please.
I don't think that requires, like, maybe that stuff is good. I don't know that requires that we need to believe in scripture or the supernatural or afterlives or the resurrection or any of that stuff. But to the extent that communal sense of bringing people together, to the extent that if we abandon religion, we stop doing those practices, that might be really bad for people.
Yeah, and so as you said, so you don't necessarily need like scripture, like you don't need like that formal like religion, but if, as you said, like it seems to be like bad though when you like step away from that, as we move away with that, you get like more secular, and then we end up like adopting a more say like functionalist like view perspective on how, and then we lose like a beautification of then say elements of our society then. Is that a sign then that people are no longer like adopting like a moral framework? Have they lost a moral framework completely? Or is it that the moral framework has changed?
That's a good question. I honestly, I don't know. So you do run into this thing that you see on college campuses that, you know, in the people in the literature will actually call it student relativism. I don't endorse student relativism. So you run into students where they'll say everything is relative or morality is relative. And then you start poking and prodding about what they think. And a lot of it centers not on some sort of meta-ethical view about like the semantics of ordinary moral claims, but it's an amalgamation of descriptive claims, like there's so much cultural variation and nobody agrees on anything, and these normative claims, like you shouldn't impose your standards on others. And I do worry that kind of attitude is, in a certain sense, a kind of rejection of morality in a certain sense. Because I think it fosters a kind of moral complacency where you don't really. It's not a good thing when there's some culture overseas or across the border that's doing some horrific thing, and you think, you know, different strokes for different folks. No. I am not okay with that. And, you know, I'm an anti-realist, and one of the main things I do is point out, anti-realists do not have to be morally complacent. We do not have to be okay with people overseas doing terrible things. So, like, strictly speaking, that is not an entailment of the view. But I do worry that there's a kind of moral malaise in at least the Western world where I don't know if it's in a bit, because you'll get weird stuff, right? With student relativists is they may say that, and then you present them, you know, some issue that they take a strong personal stance on, and they will be very aggressively opposed to it. And, you know, there's a big tweet on this recently from Henry Shevlin, I think his name is. It got like 2 million views. It like almost went viral on Metaethics, where he pointed out this apparent inconsistency. Now, technically, philosophically speaking, I don't think there's an inconsistency between being a moral relativist and having a strong commitment to your moral values. But there is something a bit strange about saying you shouldn't impose your moral standards on other people, and also what these people are doing is really bad. You need to impose your standards on them. When they're doing that, that's a conflict. And I do think people are kind of having these two conflicting views at the same time. I don't know what's going on with that. There's something very strange about that, but I'm saying a lot, so I'll pause there.
No, because that's super interesting that you're saying it, because that's something that like I resonated with, and it's also like quite reflective of the experience I had, and like maybe this would just be out of like pure interest for you, like the experience I had, say, in an Australian university, like here in Melbourne. And so I went to the University of Melbourne for both of my degrees, my commerce degree and then my like arts degree with like the anthropology and philosophy majors. And like for your context, like Melbourne like sits in like Victoria. It's probably got like an equivalent to you said you're in New York, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yep. Yeah, it has an equivalence to it in that it would be kind of like a blue state. It's probably the most like left-leaning state of Australia, and then like Melbourne itself is like considered probably like quite a left-leaning location as well. And then like ultimately, I mean, look, most universities probably like end up more like left-leaning as well. And Melbourne University is considered quite a left-leaning university. And I had this like quite surreal experience, and where my first degree was say like pre-COVID, and it was a business degree, and I was still able to do quite a few like arts subjects like in that degree. But at the time, it was where communism was like super popular, and like Marxism was like super popular. And it was like at the start of every lecture, you had like student Marxists, like communists have to like promote like a new gathering that was like going to be like happening, and it was just so rampant like throughout the university. Then my second degree, several years later, now post like COVID, the Marxist communist thing like wasn't there anymore. it actually was more about these like sexual identity. So like transgenderism was like really big, the LGBTQ, and that seemed to be the new just thing that students were like talking about. And it did make it, the questions that came out of it for me, or when thinking about it, was like, why were people like at first adopting these what were like these ideologies, and like why were they getting so like passionate about it, and why was it that they were doing it like say here in university? And I think it's a little bit different in the States from my understanding, so how it is here in like Australia. But when people are in high school, commonly we wear uniforms. It's very, very rare that you have like say a casual clothes like high school. And so if you then imagine you're going through, say, like 12 years of education, you're wearing a uniform. And so my suspicion is that people come out of like school then without a sense of like identity, in a way, a personal like identity. And then they get thrown into these like institutions where they're now having to make a very personal decision about like what it is like they're studying, but then also a very personal decision about how they're showing themselves to the rest of the world. And they're stripped out of their standard community. They don't have their friends there anymore. And now they're also having to like dress themselves as well. And so I think there is this like disorientation because they don't have a sense of like identity. They don't necessarily have a sense of like what is like right or wrong, where they might stand morally as well, because they're not going to like a church as what they might have done in the past. And then they get presented something to them like an ideology, which then allows them to orient themselves now in the world. It gives them some sense of like framework, and whether they have necessarily like thought about it like well enough, but it seemed to play out this very strange thing you spoke about, where they are so passionate about some like views here, but then when they're presented with some type of like dilemma, it seems to expose like a conflict in some way. And so just sharing that with you, I was just more wanting to share something that I like experienced, but again, like where I'm thinking about what is going on in this like framework sense, like are we potentially losing like a moral framework, or is it that it's just shifted and we've always got a moral framework and it's just shifting into like something else? Did you have any like thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. So it's really going to depend on what we mean by moral. So when researchers talk about morality, sometimes they use a kind of external operational definition where they might say something like, a moral system is any system that promotes, it's any system of norms and institutions that facilitates cooperation within a particular community. If you're using a definition like that, then the individuals within that community don't need to conceive of those norms, institutions, and practices as morality for them to be an instance of morality as per this definition. But then there's also a sense of whether or not people take themselves to be engaged in moral practices, moral judgment. And then there'd be the question of what do they mean when they engage in that. There's a bit of research on this. And so when I say that I don't think all cultures and societies have morality, I'm talking about the latter. If you operationalize it as normative institutions for facilitating cooperation and minimizing conflict, every human society has that. But not every society is going to call or construe or think about what they're doing as being moral, so to speak. And what we have in at least the Western world are, everybody is exposed to the idea of thinking in moral terms, using moral language. You're not going to find too many people that are native English speakers that have never used the word moral or said something is morally right or wrong. But if that capacity to draw that distinction and to construe the world in terms of this sort of this like good and evil, right and wrong thing, I think it has its origins in this cosmic distinction between good and evil that is rooted in monotheism. And I think it's certainly consistent with the possible ways in which humans could conceive of their normative systems to not think of them in those terms. They might think of them as there being more of a spectrum or of it not being this dichotomy between good and evil. They could think of it as there being three types of things, or it not being this sharp distinction that we have in the Western world, and that has influenced people in other parts of the world. And so part of that may be receding in society now. You see, and people are increasingly attracted to like moral gray areas and the characters that they enjoy in fantasy stories and that sort of thing. So you might see partially a breakdown of even conceiving of things in historically good and evil terms. People don't like black and whites anymore. They'll say morality is not black and white. So part of it may be a degradation of the very concept of morality. And then part of it may be a continued retention of that distinction, but people simply moralizing different things. People's moral standards have changed. And this is also true of myself, too. Like, the distinction is somewhat broken down, but I still go around saying things are right and wrong, good and evil, and my moral standards just differ from the moral standards of people in the 1950s.
Yep. And I think it's like that second lens that you were putting, or like, what do we mean when we're asked that question of like, do people have like a moral framework? I suppose that second consideration is what's like resonated with me more. But the question I think I still have is that when I'm considering the moral framework, it's in the sense of like, are people even, the moral framework is the basis for action, for like taking action, of like almost a hierarchy of like values, of not even necessarily like a what's good and evil, but like, should I do or not do? And so my concern then, or concern again, is like, my question is it, as we have maybe like a withdrawal from maybe that more black and white moral framework, are people then, say, falling into this like disorientation of where they're actually not sure of any action to take, and then they don't do like anything at that point? And so, at a very like trivial like example, seeing, say, like someone getting like assaulted like on the street, where they're not even like able to identify like, is a good or evil thing taking place here, and then like no action is then taking like place. And that was a very simple like trivial argument. But then maybe the more complex thing that is actually like ongoing is where, say, they are seeing like the like freedom of speech being like inhibited in some, say, facet of society, and then they're just not sure how to like actually engage with it because their moral framework has become, say, so disoriented, or it's just like become so say weak in a sense that then they don't know how to even like engage it, and then it's brought into like a non-action at that point.
Yeah, I don't know. So we would have to look at data on like how people behaved in the past. I suspect that people were pretty unconcerned about people overseas or in different countries in the past. I think we're probably more concerned about that now. And so, although people may seem disoriented and incapable, like there's maybe a moral malaise or moral paralysis in certain respects, you can also look at stuff like growing trends of veganism and people objecting to factory farming, and people even concerned increasingly with wild animal suffering. So people's moral circles, Peter Singer has pushed this idea of the expanding moral circle. That has increased, and I think that's a good thing. So in those respects, it looks like, I think, from my perspective at least, people have engaged in quite a bit of moral improvement, while at the same time, you see this fractioning and partitioning and breaking down of social order, and there being greater polarization and more conflict. So you have what's like, it's not like there's this uniform shift towards everybody becoming terrible pieces of human garbage. I think there's been things in a positive direction and things in a negative direction at the same time. And that's what makes this so hard to analyze and assess. And what strikes me as interesting about all of this is that although I study metaethics, I think it has so little to do with any of this. So I'm happy to talk about it, but at the same time, one of the things I find, at least I find interesting about this, is how much I don't think metaethics matters to this.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, I think even to get like an answer in the question of being like, well, no, we can't be conducive to say that people aren't losing like a moral framework. That there does seem to be like the case that people are still having like moral frameworks, as you just sort of mentioned with like Peter Singer, that their like moral like circumference is expanding into like other things. I think is like enough of an answer that I was looking for then. I suppose I'm interested then to understand then like from then, say, the anti like realist perspective, then if we're not, say, looking to like objective truths then to maybe build out like a moral framework, what is it then that, say, people like how are people then, say, building out their moral framework then, and then their understanding to then like navigate the world?
The first thing to say is that I don't think most people are anti-realists, and I don't know if they ever will be anti-realists. So how they go about doing things it may not matter too much to them. But what I can say that let's say you had a society of anti-realists. How would they do things? What are they trying to do? If you reject moral realism, what I see happening at that point is very likely that morality comes down to a question of negotiating competing goals and values. So the analogy you could give would be a very simple scenario where, let's say you have two people they crash their ship, they're on an island. And on one side of the island, there's like coconuts and running water, and so there's access to like hydration, but there's no protein. The other side, there's like fish or something like that. Now, if the two people that survive and are shipwrecked on this island, one of them occupies the side with the fish, one occupies the side with the water, they're going to need the other's resources. And so one solution to that is kill the other person and take all the stuff on the island. But maybe they don't want to kill each other, or maybe it would be very risky. And so what they could do is, one of them could say, hey, look, I've got some coconuts over here. I got fresh water over here. I'm happy to share it with you, but you got to give me some of those fish. And then the other person could say, okay, X amount of coconuts for X amount of fish. They negotiate that deal. Now, there's no objective fact of the matter mandating, like at least on the anti-realist view, how that they have to do this. It's not objectively wrong for one of them to bash the other over the head with a coconut. The other could try bashing him over the head with a fish. I don't know how well that would work. So there's no objective rules that they have to negotiate, that they have to get along. There's no objective facts about the exchange rate of coconuts to fish. This is all a matter of what each person is individually willing to accept. So it might be 2 coconuts per fish or something like that. So all of this would be mediated through people acting in their own, with respect to their own goals and interests, and they may reach an agreement. So morality becomes a matter of collective diplomacy or collective negotiation. And once you construe it in those terms, I think if anything, I suspect that would improve things. So I want society to be a certain way. You want society to be a certain way. There's a lot of people out there that have very different perspectives and values on what they want society to be like. Once we recognize that there are no stance-independent moral truths, we're no longer just saying, my views are true, your views are false. No. Your views are false, my views are true. Instead of having that argument, we have an argument of, look, I want this, you want that. What can we do so that we're not stabbing each other to death and that we try to get along that we can? Now, there might be scenarios, because what realists will say is, there could just be a serial killer or a community of people that just want to eat people. They're just insane cannibals or insane terrorists or something. And they're not going to negotiate. Yeah? Well, you think realism is going to change that? Like, what, you think you're going to go to these groups and convince them of realism, and then they'll go, oh, what we're doing is wrong? I don't think so. If you're some mugger catches you in an alleyway, convincing them of what they're doing is objectively wrong is probably not your best strategy. Like pointing to a security camera saying you don't want to get caught, you're appealing to their interests. Their interest is to not go to prison, or threatening them. If that's probably that's not a good move. But the point is, whatever you do in that scenario, appealing to that person's interests is likely your best way to get out of that scenario safely and alive. And so I already think that this is how we typically approach social scenarios. It's a question of diplomacy and negotiation. So I think at least rejecting realism would clear away the excess, like superfluous arguments that we don't need to have, and we could focus on building the kind of societies that we want. So that's how I would approach it.
Yeah, and so how did you refer to it? With like collective diplomacy?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, cool. And so if we're engaging in this like collective like diplomacy, is that suggestive of anything that like predicates that collective diplomacy, or like that capacity for collective like diplomacy?
Sorry, what's the question?
So the question is like, if we are engaging in like collective diplomacy, the fact that we're like doing that, is it suggestive of something that predicates the capacity to do that? Like, is it suggestive of like a capacity for like, like building out like a framework?
Sure. Yeah. I'm assuming people can do this. I think it's because people already have done this. But, you take the terrorists or the insane cannibals or whatever. There may be instances of individuals or communities where they're unwilling to negotiate or they're not capable of negotiating. And in those cases, conflict is inevitable. I think that that's just a reality. If aliens showed up to Earth and they don't care about our moral values and their only goal is to consume all the resources of planets and they just want to eat us and strip mine the planet, I'm not going to sit down and have a cup of tea with them. We got to fight them. It's like Independence Day or something. That's just the reality that we're in. And you could run into individuals. You could run into a psychopath that just really loves peeling people's skin off and making lampshades out of it. You don't negotiate with that person. You stop them. You put them in prison or something. And so some conflicts are unavoidable. I don't think that's a problem for anti-realism. Just like too bad. Some people don't want to negotiate. So in my view, I'm assuming people want to negotiate, but there might be circumstances where they're unwilling to.
Yep. Yeah, I suppose then, so as you said, it seems to be reality has then this this capacity for us to build out these frameworks, which then the consequences are getting to this collective diplomacy. Then I think this is where then my meta-ethical questions come up of well, is there anything that predicates, is there anything objective about that framework that we, or even our capacity to build out that framework? And so I think that's what's then led me to this question of this principle of maximizing freedom that I've thought about, where if there isn't objectively a good and evil, and we say we're working towards this collective diplomacy, or whether that's the case or not, is there something that has to predicate that framework, that capacity for the framework? And that's where I've been, I suppose, engaging with this idea of, well, is freedom the objective truth here? And can freedom be the objective moral truth? Because having freedom then allows for good and evil to be identified at that point. And then I suppose the principle of maximizing freedom in getting there is that, well, what action then most preserves and then deepens the freedom of those involved? And so the very say simple example is well, if I murder person A, well, that's not maximizing their freedom, because I'm inhibiting their ability to just go about and fulfilling their destiny. But say I murder terrorist B, well, their intentions are that they're going to say blow up 100 people, and so by me killing terrorists A, they've already sort of forsaken their right to freedom, because they're already inhibiting the freedom of these other people. And so in that, I'm able to identify, well, it's bad or it's evil to kill man A, but it's good to kill terrorists B, because that freedom has been taken away from these other individuals. And so that's where I'm considering, well, that can freedom be identified then as an objective truth? Can it be identified as the objective moral truth for which then good and evil can be identified from? And that's where I think I then conflict to myself, well, is there this objectivism here? Is there a moral realism at that level?
Yeah, I don't know that there would be. I mean, on my view, there wouldn't be a moral realism on that level. Okay. What I can say, I had a discussion with a friend of mine, Sam Rosen. You might appreciate that discussion, where what he talks about would be something like this: if you and I, or you, have a conflict, there are going to be whatever my goals are and whatever your goals are, assuming that we're not completely irrational. There's going to be these sort of game theoretic optimums that we could, in principle, reach. So it could be two organisms run into one another. They both want a particular piece of land. And if they were both in a position to recognize the cost of the conflict between them, they might know if they both fight, one of them is going to win, the other is going to lose, and they're both going to walk away with injuries. And so it's best to just not bother fighting. Maybe you just let the bigger one, or the one that's likely to win the fight, to have the territory. Now, organisms actually do this. They don't just you don't see animals fighting over territory always fight ruthlessly to the death no matter what. They will back off, and they'll often back off without a fight. And so what you see is that when you come into conflicts with one another, there are going to be facts of the matter about there's going to be these sort of abstract and higher order facts about what sort of strategies or solutions are going to tend to be optimal for conflict resolution. I don't know that freedom in particular would necessarily be included within that framework. So this is going to be some output of some sort of game theory type stuff. So I do think that there are stance-independent facts about game theoretic optimums, but they are still sitting on top of there being agents with conflicting goals or values. And so there are facts, there's descriptive facts about this is how, so conditional on me having a set of goals and someone else having a set of goals, there are going to be facts about how I can optimize my goals conditional on that person having conflicting goals. And those facts will not depend on my goals. So there's a stance-independent fact. Now, that doesn't give you realism because it's still just a descriptive fact. But what's interesting about those kinds of facts is that it's true that if I act on them, it will optimize for my goals, and it's not up to me. And so you do end up getting these these facts that have normative implications that are sense independently true, but they're not like binding on me. So, I think I gave him examples of like someone that just has the value, like let's say I have the value, or let's say it doesn't have to be me. Let's say we run into an organism that goes through the universe and its only goal is to optimize maximum amount of conflict, chaos, and destruction. And the only thing it wants to do is kill everybody it encounters. Well, you could say, but what about these game theoretic optimums? It could just value refusing to comply with game theoretic optimums, and it wouldn't be making, on my view, a mistake. It wouldn't be factually incorrect about what it should or shouldn't do. And so this, I don't think really gives you realism, like full-blown realism. So, and I don't think that it can. So those are the kinds of facts that I think that we could allow and that look kind of realistish if you squint just right. But that's about all that you get. As far as your proposal, I would need to hear more to see how that might fit into like my particular anti-realist view.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so with what you shared there, we're talking about potentially like these like organisms that act in their own for like their own interests, and you mentioned like to like animals that might be like conflicting, and so whether it's like the right example to be like engaging on, but I suppose when I'm thinking about whether there's like a realist or like an anti-realist reality, it's just for say like humans. So we in the scenario of like say two animals conflicting, my issue with that is that there's no consciousness to both of these beings in the same way that like humans have like consciousness. That I see them more as just operating at an instinctual level, and so they're not really working in a framework of any way. They're not really working in like a moral framework in any way. Potentially we can consider that it beyond like humans, in where it is these just like intellectual or like conscious beings, and so maybe that's how we can work this like conscious intellectual being that's like sole value is to just cause like conflict and like destruction. I suppose how I'm like then feeling about, or my initial like knee-jerk reaction to that was that for the intellectual like conscious being to even like want to be like doing that or valuing like that as a goal, and to go about like that activity, for it even to like say go about that to be going about creating like chaos suggests that there was like freedom to begin with. For it even to be like say valuing that to be wanting about to causing destruction or to causing like chaos. And so if there's that value, if it is freedom to already like begin with, that freedom seems to be like suggestive of like an objective like truth. Now you mentioned before, like, is this like a stance like independent like factor? It might be, and so maybe I'm trying to maybe even work that out. But that freedom there that exists for like choice to be made, for action to like be taken of a free will type, not a deterministic like type, is still suggestive to me as this like objective like truth, and potentially that's where then the realism like sits there. But it might be this more stance independent fact, which maybe I'm trying to work out with you.
Yeah, I don't know how you're going to get realism out of that. So, the kind of like, so on my view, I don't think that there are stance-independent moral facts, but I take a different stance towards naturalist realists and non-naturalist realists. Naturalist realists can squeeze out stance-independent moral facts if they want to. I just don't think that those facts, like, I'm going to have problems. I'm going to reject those views anyway. But what I would say about those views is that even if they were true, they would be trivial. But if you're trying to give like a naturalist framework, I might, depending on how you frame it, I might say, okay, well, technically that's true, but those facts would be trivial. They wouldn't have any of the sort of characteristics that I project in non-naturalist realism. They lack clout, practical authority, oomph. There's a variety of terms that people use for them. I don't know how you get non-naturalist realism out of the picture that you're describing. because what I would be looking for in that case is whether you have some sort of irreducibly normative fact, some fact about what one should do or shouldn't do, about what's morally good or bad. And from what you're describing, I haven't located those facts in the description. It's not to say they're not there, but like this would have to be elaborated, you know, for me to get a sense of like what those facts are. So I don't know if you take a stance on the naturalism, non-naturalism divide, or how you see your view in light of that distinction. So I just need more details.
Yeah, of course. I mean, like, in a non-naturalist, like naturalist, like divide, like how would I consider this? I mean, what do I say? Like, I don't probably see myself as a naturalism, like coming in here. Like, I'm definitely not like deterministic. Like, I think we've all got like, say, like a free will, but I think there's, say, some, maybe there's like this naturalistic like quality in that there is like freedom of choice. Would that be like accurate to say?
Yeah, well, free will is perfectly consistent with naturalism. You could, for instance, be a compatibilist about free will. So it's also going to depend on your conception of what free will is. So you have intersecting philosophical positions to take on a range of issues here. And, you know, you could locate yourself within the standard analytic categorical framework. Like they have their boxes. They've got naturalism versus non-naturalism. And then you've got, for free will, you've got compatibilism and libertarian conceptions of free will, and then there's going to be a bunch of subcategories of like libertarian free will is a bunch of categories. You could locate yourself with that in that space, or maybe you're outside of that space. So like my anti-realist view doesn't fit into any of the traditional anti-realist frameworks, and so it often takes a while for me to lay it out. You know, I don't like, I could evaluate the view both within those boxes or outside of those boxes. I don't know where you stand on all that.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe I just need to like go back and like think about it more. But if we can consider that there like we're just talking about, like there is freedom in the sense that like we can make free choices, that there is, say, like chaos in the universe in which like not everything is just purely like action and then like consequence, and then because of that consequence there's another action, and then because of that action there's another like consequence, that it's not just, say, like, you know, one thing like after another, that there is a degree of like chaos like in the universe, that things can just like unravel, there is coincidence, and that within that, say, like a coincidence, there is choice that people can like make as well. And that for me, like that's suggestive that there is freedom, and that freedom, like that it's true that there is freedom there, and not at a moral level yet, but the fact that there is, say, this freedom suggests to me that is then like good, because to argue against, say, the truth of this like freedom, does it like couldn't be like to argue against the reality of like freedom being the case, which is like arguing for like an anti-truth, and that would be like bad. And so from that, if we're looking at, okay, well, if this freedom like exists, then can we build on that like a moral framework? If freedom is true, can like objective truths like come out of that? Because it is objectively like true. You know, can good then come out of that? Does that make sense?
I would need to hear more. So I mean, it's really going to depend on what you mean by free will. So like I could tell you, like within the contemporary analytic literature on free will, a pretty standard way to characterize free will is to say that it's like the set of conditions that an agent has to have in order to be subject to like desert-based moral responsibility, and so or praise and blame. And so the very notion of free will is intimately bound up in normative considerations from the outset. So if you're starting from scratch with like, here's free will independent of the normative stuff, now let's see how it syncs up with that. Oh man, I'd have to see that laid out to see how that's supposed to work, because like standard characterizations of free will I'm familiar with, they're already kind of bound up in one another, that free will is just already connected to normative considerations. The thing though is that I don't see any inconsistency between speaking incompatibilist or even a libertarian conception of free will and still being an anti-realist, because you could still construe moral responsibility in anti-realist terms. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure you're going to easily or in some automatic way get a realism out of that. You could be a realist and believe in free will. Obviously, those go hand in hand very well. But free will is. I don't think it's going to have too much of a problem with anti-realism about morality.
Maybe I could ask you then to say, like, elaborate on that further, and like, let's say we're looking at it from that more classical, like, a libertarian like view of like free will. Then, how is it the case then that that still like lines up with an anti-realism perspective then?
Well, I don't know of anybody that is a proponent of both libertarian free will and anti-realism. It would be really interesting to find somebody that endorses both views. So a person may think that there are facts of the matter about who has free will, the conditions under which they have free will, and what that free will consists in. They may be an incompatibilist. They may think that determinism is false, and they may think that we are subject to a kind of desert-based moral responsibility. How they would end up squaring that with anti-realism, I'm not entirely sure. But maybe a fairly natural fit would be some type of constructivist view. So they could be a constructivist about morality. And so if they are, then they might think that there are a set of, there could be a single set of moral facts that everybody is subject to, and that people are morally responsible with respect to those facts. It's just those facts, for instance, let's say they're an ideal observer theorist, and they think that moral facts depend on what a fully informed and ideally rational agent would endorse. Or maybe they think that God endowed us with free will, and that we have a capacity to act on our moral standards, or opt not to because we have free will, but that moral facts ultimately are enforced by God and do depend on God's stances. So they could endorse an explicitly anti-realist conception of divine command theory. I'm not saying divine command theory has to be anti-realist, but they could think, look, God issues commands, you could choose to follow them or not. There's no stance-independent fact of the matter about whether you ought to, but you are subject to moral responsibility if you do violate those standards. Maybe that's a strain for a libertarian conception of free will. I'm not sure. But that's a couple possibilities that I could float. I don't know of anybody defending a view like that. So maybe they would say, no, you can't get anti-realism with libertarian free will, not in any easy way. But philosophers are masters of coming up with hair-splitting and weird, apparent inconsistent positions and trying to thread those needles. So it wouldn't surprise me if someone does endorse these views and they've defended them somewhere. So, I don't know.
I suppose it's just because that in a weird way, it's like that's how it seems like I'm like going down, like floating down like this direction, and it does feel very like strange, and it is conflicting for me as well. And so there's like part of me trying to like figure it out as well. And I apologize I couldn't come to you with like say this hard framework and answer, because I know like philosophers like to have that so that they can like critique it, bring it down, and say like, no, this is where it went wrong, where this is this. Whereas it is something that like I'm at a very exploratory like stage with myself, where like I think it came just from a professor several years ago, like when we were discussing about the like ontology like of like good and evil, and it made me ask like, is there something that exists prior to like good and evil? If it's something that you can't necessarily like point at, but like we can say it does. I think, sorry, you said before that you don't believe that most people act as if they're anti-realist. You believe that most people act as if they are realists. Is that right? Sorry.
No, I don't think people. I don't think that there are any. I don't think realism or anti-realism have a big practical effect on how people act. So I think they. Okay. I endorse the view that they act neither like realists or anti-realists, or you could say they act like both. Because I don't think there's a big practical difference in how they act.
Right. Okay. And so could you like articulate, how you think they might act, or it doesn't even come into like the question that...
Well, not with respect to metaethics, because I just don't think it influences people's behavior. Okay. So when it comes to people's everyday moral judgments and behavior, I think that they have normative moral stances, and they apply them to specific cases. But because I think that take myself. Okay, so I see a person hit another person and say, "Give me all your money." I'm gonna say, "Hey, don't do that," or I might call the police. Like all the actual things I would do are the exact same things you might expect a moral realist with upstanding moral values to do. What would we do that's different? Well, we might say different things in a philosophy conference. We might write a different thing in a philosophy blog. So there are differences in what we say and do, but there's no like logical entailment that if I'm an anti-realist, I'm going to like not care if someone's trying to rob somebody. There's no requirement that if this works in both directions. There's no requirement that if someone's a moral realist, they're going to go around and be super judgmental or rigid about their moral views. They might not. They might go, I don't care if they steal. So there's not any obvious observable like everyday typical behavior that would tell. Like think of it this way: you're watching a person go about their everyday life. And you see them, maybe they tell a little white lie, they skim a little money off the top, they take a pen from work that they're not supposed to take, but they're very good to their kids, and they're good to their family, and they donate money to church. So you see them do some good things, some bad things. Which part of that would indicate that they're a realist or an anti-realist? I don't think anything. I don't think so basically I think realists and anti-realists more or less act identically in almost every practical circumstance.
Okay, but is there any like merit is like for us to like go forward and judge then the actions that are taking place from an anti-realist or a realist perspective, because it might be say how we then like structure our society, it might be how we then like say culturally like evolve, how we like enforce like or create laws, because just in the same way that like most people don't engage with that part, but we trust in the fact that like those things have been like set up, and that's come from a say logical like standpoint. And so then is there the merit for like us to be like judging these things from an anti-realist or realist perspective?
Both realism and anti-realism in abstracta, like both positions are consistent with judging people by any set of normative moral standards. Some realist or anti-realist positions may sort of straddle the line between being both a meta-ethical position and a normative moral position. And when they do, that's going to put some restrictions on them. So if you're an agent relativist and you think that individuals or let's say you're an individual agent relativist, that's a view that whether an action is right or wrong is determined by the standards of the agent performing the action. Well, if that's the case, and someone is going around killing people because they think it's morally good, then it is in fact morally good for that person to do that. So does that have normative implications? Arguably, it does have normative moral implications. And so that's a quote-unquote meta-ethical position, but it's a meta-ethical position that has straightforward logical entailments about the normative consequences of the view in specific cases. Not every meta-ethical position is like that. So if you're an error theorist, there's no specific way that you're obligated to act. You could stop a person from stealing or not stop them. You can help people or not help people. And it's the same thing with like non-naturalist realism. That's going to be consistent with any possible set of moral standards. So both realism and anti-realism, depending on which view you hold within those positions, are consistent with moral judgment, structuring society in any particular way. You'd have to look at the specific view to see whether it has sort of built-in strictures on what sort of normative standards you could have.
Right. Okay. So like if you're sitting in like the anti-realist like camp, it doesn't necessarily like give you the we'll say like the framework or like the variables to be able to like judge an action definitively, because it depends like the specific like theory underneath anti-realism that you might like subscribe to be able to like critique it.
Yeah, so let's take my view. So I'm an anti-realist quietist. I reject all the standard views because I don't endorse the semantic theses. So my view is pretty minimalist in terms of its metaphysical commitments. I deny that there are stance independent moral facts. Okay. So now, as far as what normative moral standards are consistent with that, I could have any normative moral standards. So I could be super judgmental or not. I could be super morally complacent. I could go around imposing my standards on everybody. So the meta-ethical position I have is consistent with all normative standards.
Okay.
Could be any.
Then what might be then like the practical consequences for like how people live if they're then adopting this like moral anti-realism, like quietism?
I don't know that there's any practical consequences. That's why I spend a lot of time arguing. Like people will depict anti-realism as this like super evil, awful position where they'll say if you reject that there's people say stuff like this. If you deny that there's objective moral facts, then every moral position is equally valid as every other, and you have no business judging Hitler as doing something bad. That's not an entailment of being an anti-realist. So I can judge Hitler as being bad. according to my moral standards. Now, someone might say, well, who cares about your standards? I never said you have to care about my standards. Presumably, hopefully, you share those standards. And if you do, let's go, lock arms and condemn Hitler together. But if you don't, now I just think you're a big jerk. So I don't think you're factually mistaken about the stance independent moral facts, because I don't think there are any. But that in no way impedes me from stopping other people, judging other people, acting on my standards. So I don't think it carries significant practical implications. I just don't.
And so does it, I suppose, like, are there any like practical implications though for how, like, say you act as like an individual when you might like go about and say have to engage in like a moral like dilemma, or are there also like practical consequences for then how you engage in like, say, the laws of society, which we could assume that have been based around like some sense of like moral standard as well?
Yeah, so there might be some indirect ones. So, like, I'm not going to think that they're like, okay, take human rights. So people might say that there's rights enshrined in the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence or whatever it is. Well, I see all rights as social constructions. And so I'm totally fine with abandoning a particular document or rejecting a particular standard. I'm totally fine with just moral reform. I have no qualms about changing moral standards and changing my mind. That degree of flexibility, though, is also tactically available to realists, because a realist could just think, I've discovered, or via intuition or moral reflection, what the real moral facts are. They're inconsistent with this old school construal of our rights. Like, let's say it's like rights, but only applicable to men. And someone might think, no, I don't think they're only applicable to men. I think they're applicable to everybody. So they could just, but they could think that that's objectively correct. And so on my view, I wouldn't be making progress towards discovering the stance independent moral facts. I'd just be having a different set of moral preferences, and the realist would be believing or considering themselves to have acquired knowledge of the correct set of stance independent moral facts. So they can arrive at the same place. How they arrive there might be different, and there might be practical differences. Like, it might be faster or slower for me to change my mind about a moral issue than a realist. I don't know. That's going to turn out to be an empirical question, and I don't know the answers to those questions. There's not a whole lot of research on like the longitudinal effects of long-term, commitment to moral anti-realism and how it influences how a person changes their mind, how they reason. What I can say is, I was an anti-realist as long as I've been doing moral philosophy, as long as I can remember, and for a long time I was very strongly committed to utilitarianism as a moral philosophy. For a very, very long time, I was like a fundamentalist utilitarian. It's the only viable theory. Some years ago, it gradually began to unravel, and I stopped being a utilitarian. I now say I'm a retired utilitarian. I never adopted an alternative normative moral framework. Is that because I started getting really active in promoting anti-realism? Maybe. I'm not sure. And so one thing can happen that I think may happen with anti-realism is that it can lead to a degradation in the sense that there is a principled set of overarching normative moral principles that govern our moral standards. That like there's got to be this principled framework at the base, and it could be that anti-realists are more disposed towards particularism, meaning that instead of having a principled moral framework where everything is rooted in some shared set of principles, I have a moral position about that, moral position about this, moral position about that. So that's what I've moved towards, and that might be because I'm an anti-realist. I don't know. And if that's the case, that could have practical consequences for my moral reasoning, my moral argumentation, and the moral positions I hold. So I'm totally open to that being a possibility.
Yeah, because I think that's like the bigger question like I have then is like, do them, if you start like going down that route, is like the final like position that you just have this complete, say, like disorientation then at that point, because you haven't got, say, like this more the cardinal like principle that you can look up to then, which I like the answer to it, it's more that wonder of like, is that where it keeps going to?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't feel disoriented. In fact, I find something to be kind of liberating about not thinking that I have to pass all my moral standards through some filter. So, if you're a utilitarian, or you express a commitment to utilitarianism, and then someone comes along and they're like, look, we've discovered it would maximize utility to like wipe out this population of wild animals or something, and you find that repugnant, you might go, ugh, well, I'm a utilitarian, so I guess I got to do this repugnant thing. Whereas I might go, I'm not doing that. I don't want to. So You might think that means I could promote me doing immoral things, but it might also prevent me from doing immoral things.
Yeah. And I'm interested to ask then, so maybe it was like easy to like answer that like thought experiment. Have you come across like any challenging like moral like thought experiments lately that have been really challenging for you to answer or like come to a decision on because you haven't say had that principle, that cardinal principle moral framework to go back to?
I can't think of any specifically because of that, but I can think of a broader one which has to do with my other philosophical commitments. So I'm not just a quietist about the metaethical questions. I'm also a quietist about consciousness. So I don't believe in phenomenal consciousness or qualia. And I do recall in grad school someone raising a concern. At the time I was an illusionist, so I had a slightly different position, but I was still denying that there's qualia. Now, what they were asking me is, well, hold up. If you don't think that people have conscious experiences of pain and suffering in the phenomenal sense, how can you remain committed to your moral standards? Like, what fundamentally is it that you think is right or wrong that is happening to people or that's occurring to people? Because if you think that this is all in some sense some sort of illusion, what is it that you think is bad that's happening to people? Like, it's a bad functional state? Like, how can you really be so invested in morality if you think that we're basically automatons shambling about and going, like, if my sense of something bad happening is a person going, I don't like this. Like, why do I think that's... So I thought that was really challenging because it does give me a sense that there might be something deeply arbitrary about what things I care about and what I don't care about. And that troubles me. There's a kind of existential dread I have in the potential inconsistency between my like really caring about my family a whole lot and then also thinking, there's not really a good reason to think that they're more important than anybody else. What do I do about that? And more generally, that like there's not really a good like I don't have a robust, deep philosophical justification for thinking that suffering is bad. I don't like suffering. I think it's bad. There should be less of that. And there is something kind of a little unsatisfying about that. It's just I don't like it. That's my reason for opposing it. Wouldn't it be nice if I could say, and it's deeply bad, and I get a little bit of a sense of where realists are coming from, where they can draw on this outside authority that it's not just I don't want it. Ultimately, I reject that, and I don't fully I don't find that so important that I'm like constantly struggling with cognitive dissonance. But that does it's the same way. Like, I'd feel a lot better if there was an afterlife that I was going to that was good. I don't think there is one. That's kind of a bummer. So it's similar to that. It's a bit of a bummer, but it's not making me abandon the view.
Yeah. Okay. And so does it then have like any do you see any like cognitive dissonance when you like say are reviewing the ways you might act, where say the way you might act where like, you know, that care for your family that you have, you are like say putting that in a higher like value position as opposed to like how you might act towards like say another random person like on the street, in which you'll hold your family in high regard, you'll protect them say like first over some like random person. Like when you're looking at posthumously like looking at like how you might act, does that cause like a cognitive dissonance at all?
I think maybe it could if I was like really sitting down and reflecting on it. But when you put on your philosopher hat, you could get this sense of like you could experience various sorts of conflicts. Like you put your views on the table and you look at them and you're like, these don't really fit together so well. Ugh, what do I do about that? But then, you go through that conversation, you end it, and then you go to sleep, you wake up the next day, you got bills to pay. And, my dad calls me, I want to talk to my dad. I'm not going to go, sorry, Dad, you're not technically any more important than anybody else I could talk to, so this is completely arbitrary. There's no point in having this conversation. I don't do that. Like, I take off the philosophy hat and I go about my life. So, are there instances or moments when I experience dissonance? Yeah, it's not so often these days that I've really delved into those conflicts, and maybe I should, because purging those conflicts is part of developing a very streamlined and internally coherent view. But I've also stepped away from thinking that that's such a critical and important thing to do. A lot of philosophy is motivated by this goal of achieving reflective equilibrium and having all of our views consistent with one another. And one thing that's interesting to note about that is that to the extent that we're all pursuing that relies on the presumption that we're not currently in a state of reflective equilibrium. So somehow we're able to operate in a state of where there's all these conflicts, and as long as we're not considering them, we don't notice them. And they don't bother us if we keep them out of sight. But why is that so important? Like, why is it so important to have an internally consistent worldview? That is itself a value that I don't have an obligation. So maybe I could just live with some contradictions and be okay with that.
Yeah, I suppose that my thought is that on that is that people are going about without this equilibrium, but that is causing issues. It is causing an internal suffering, but it's also creating a societal suffering or a community suffering at that point. Again, I don't have this empirical evidence to argue that with you now, but that's say a suspicion I have at that point, which is then where I started thinking about is there this moral framework loss coming in at that point? I did want to ask one more question, but I know we've sort of been chatting for about an hour and 37 minutes at this point. Is it all right for me to ask that question? I'm not interrupting your dinner, am I?
I'll have to get to it at some point, but I've got a few minutes.
Okay, yeah. As we were just chatting about this, potential cognitive dissonance, has there been a realist framework that has almost gotcha, or just intrigued you enough to investigate it quite thoroughly, and do you ever go back to it and thought, maybe actually I can lean more that way?
No, I don't think so. There is one that I think is intriguing and that I should look into more. Let me make sure I get the name. I think it's Sharon Hewitt-Rowlett has this view that I haven't really looked into, where it ties the notion of moral goodness and badness to qualia. And the idea would be that there are certain sorts of qualitative states that are themselves good or bad, and that you can capture rightness or wrongness in terms of those intrinsically good or bad experiential states. For whatever reason, that was published in a book. I haven't seen that view work its way into the contemporary academic metaethics literature. I don't know if she's published articles on the topic either. When I encountered that, I was like, "Ooh, that's a tricky one." Now, I'm a qualia quietist, so I don't even think there are qualia. So that's just mixing two views I reject together. So it's pretty easy for me on principle grounds to just say, well, two wrongs don't make a right. I just reject the view outright. But I do think it's an interesting view, and I think it's worth discussing and considering. So there's that one out there.
Okay.
The main issue for me is that I've become increasingly convinced that some of the concepts that non-naturalist realists at least are employing may not even be meaningful, but the issue is that they could be, and it could be that I'm the problem. Now, I don't think that that's the case, but what that's pushed me towards are these deeper metaphilosophical issues, which is that what if there are certain concepts that some people can have access to, but that other people can't? How would we know, and how would we resolve those disputes? And I'm increasingly concerned that there may be irresolvable disputes that are predicated on underlying differences in the psychology of different people, where there's not anything you could say or do that could make someone go, oh, now I see why I'm wrong. Because they're basically it's like you're running one set of software, I'm running another set of software, and I just can't process that code. That's a bad metaphor. I don't like computer brain metaphors, but that's a problem for me, because maybe we can't solve every philosophical problem. If that's the case.
I do get that, because there's something I've just found out recently, that apparently it's I don't know if it's 1 in 5 people, or it might be a bit more, just don't have an inner monologue. It just doesn't exist for them. And so that seems to be an example of what you're talking about.
Yeah, and then there's aphantasia. So I think someone has recently proposed a name for no inner monologue, but other people are incapable of voluntarily producing mental imagery. So if you ask them to picture an apple, they can't.
Can't do it.
And I don't see any reason to doubt that this is true. I don't, I think there's been some neuroscientific research that seems to corroborate that. I don't know about the inner monologue thing, but again, I don't see any particularly good reason to say, no, everyone has an inner monologue. I have an inner monologue. But I think it would be a profound mistake to presume that because I experience the world in a particular way, that everyone must experience the world that way. But, this is something I run into with non-naturalist moral realists. many of them typically rely on appeals to ethical intuitions and to support their moral realism. They'll say, well, it seems to us that there are these stance independent moral facts. It doesn't seem that way to me. And so they are effectively appealing to something amounting to quasi-perceptual, and in some cases, they will literally, there's like moral perception theories where they argue that you're literally perceiving moral facts. I don't know how, perception to me is an empirical thing where you're sensing the world around you. They're not perceiving moral facts, but they even describe it in terms of it like something striking you as true, it's seeming to be the case, you seeing that there's moral facts. I don't have those kinds of experiences. Now, something is going on there. Either they are having experiences I'm not having, which raises questions about whether maybe moral realism is right and there's just something profoundly wrong with me. I don't think that's the case, and I sure hope it's not the case. But if that's not happening, then what is happening? So they're thinking they're having experiences, and they're either not having those experiences, or they're profoundly wrong about the content of those experiences, because that's what I have to adhere to. And then that makes, and this brings us all the way back to the start of the conversation. I have to give a psychological explanation about why people would purport to perceive things or experience the world a certain way, and yet they're completely mistaken about that. And I often make comparisons to people like seeing auras. So I don't think people could see auras. I don't think people like energy, like someone has a pink aura or a green aura. I don't think that's a real thing. And yet, I could probably take people to some guru mystic class where they purport to, if you squint hard enough and ponder the nature of reality, you could see auras around people. I bet you could train people to think that they could see auras. But I don't think they would be. So are they not perceiving auras, but they mistakenly think they are? Or are human brains able to have self-induced hallucinations where they're actually seeing what looks like an aura, but it's a completely natural thing? It's not, they're not actually, the person doesn't have an aura. Their brain is doing something quirky. Because I think the least plausible thing is that people are actually learning to see auras. So what I suspect is it might actually be going on is that academic philosophy can actually induct people into thinking into ways that make them mistakenly think that they're having experiences or phenomenology or perceptions either they're not having, or they're misinterpreting their experiences. And if that's the case, I don't know how to prove that. I don't know how to get data on that. This seems like a wild question to explore.
Yeah, it is. That's a fascinating question to explore. You've given me something that I could ruminate on for the rest of the day. Look, I won't keep you from your dinner and family any longer. So, look, Lance, thank you so much for the conversation today. It was really, really enjoyable for me, and I hope it was fun for you as well. I know it wasn't a strict philosophy conversation as well, which seems to be more of what you do. But thank you so much for your time. I thoroughly appreciate it.
Yeah, this is a blast. This is a very unusual conversation, which is a good thing. I constantly worry that I'm talking about the realism, anti-realism stuff way too much. It's good to go down different paths. So I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me here.
Of course, absolutely. Until next time.